In this presentation, I'll be reviewing bias terms at multiple levels. It's important that we start on the same page with this vocabulary so that we understand one another as we talk about these kinds of issues. The last thing we need in difficult conversations about touchy subjects is to get upset about vocabulary. Today, we will be defining stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, oppression, and privilege. A stereotype is a belief that oversimplifies an entire group of people. Let's break this down. First, a stereotype is a generalization about a group. You can't have a stereotype about a single person or thing. It's always going to be about a broader group. So you can't have a stereotype about your neighbor Paul. But you might have a stereotype about the people in your neighborhood or about people called Paul. You can have stereotypes about any group of people as long as the group is big and diverse enough that no one fact will be true about all of them. Second, a stereotype is a belief. Beliefs are ideas we hold to be true. You might believe that climate change is caused by humans. You may believe that red cars are less likely to be involved in accidents. Beliefs are ideas that you consider to be facts. So, stereotypes are generalized beliefs about a group of people. For example, all French people drink wine. All French people smoke. All French people eat escargot. There are two distinguishing factors about stereotypes. First, because they're beliefs, they only exist in people's minds. Beliefs are very different from behaviors. Just because you believe that red cars get into fewer accidents doesn't mean you only travel in red cars. Beliefs exist only in your mind, and therefore so do stereotypes. Second, stereotypes can be negative, but they can also be positive. For example, a common stereotype is that Black people are athletic. Our culture values athleticism, so we might say this is a positive stereotype. It's still an oversimplification and generalization about an entire group of people, and it does not allow room for variation, diversity, or exceptions. Why do you think even a positive stereotype might be problematic? How might even positive associations be harmful? In summary, stereotypes are an oversimplification about an entire group of people, a belief that only exists in people's minds, and not necessarily negative, but definitely problematic. Prejudice is a negative attitude about an entire group of people that devalues that group. Unlike a stereotype, prejudice is not just a belief. Prejudice is often based on beliefs, but it moves beyond what is true or false into ideas about what is good or bad. Prejudice is an evaluation or a judgment. Prejudice, by definition, is a negative evaluation. So if you feel that French people are untrustworthy and you like them less than people from other countries, then we would say that you are prejudiced against French people. Often, prejudice is based on beliefs. If you believe that French people are unhygienic, that they are snobs, that they're selfish and cowardly, then you're probably going to be prejudiced against them. But sometimes, prejudice is due to culture. You may not actively or intentionally believe anything particularly negative about a group of people, but still be prejudiced against them. For example, if you grew up in a culture that devalues, say, Black people, you may find yourself prejudiced without wanting to be or meaning to be. You might even be Black and still hold prejudice against Black people. Psychologists at Harvard developed an implicit attitude test that measures our biases, the ones we may not even be aware of. The first time I took one of these tests, I learned that I was really prejudiced against Christians, but positively biased towards Buddhists. What? Why? Where did that come from? I don't even know any Buddhists. I certainly didn't have any fully formed beliefs about them, but there I was, quickly able to associate positive traits with Buddhists, but not so with Christians. And I grew up Christian. To get a better sense of your own prejudice, you too can take an implicit association test. You'll find a link in the module. To recap, prejudice is an attitude that, like stereotypes, only exists in people's minds. Unlike stereotypes, though, prejudice is an evaluation, a judgment about a group of people. That evaluation is negative by definition. Finally, prejudice can be something we are unaware of or even that we wish we didn't hold. Discrimination happens when people act on their prejudice. It is a behavior or a set of behaviors that treats one group worse than the rest. If I am prejudiced against French people, I might never act on it. But if I discriminate against French people, it means I treat them differently and notably worse than everybody else. I might choose not to date French people, not to hire French people, or not to eat at their restaurants. Calling someone a name, refusing to give them service, ignoring them, or treating them differently than you would anyone else because they belong to a particular group are all examples of discrimination. Like with prejudice, it is possible to discriminate against a group without intending to. Black people will often be told, "Oh, you're so eloquent or articulate." The implication, whether intentional or not, is that it's unusual for a Black person to be intelligent. So discrimination is built on prejudice. It is a behavior, a thing we do, that treats people from a group worse than others. Now, discrimination can be against any group. I can discriminate against Black people. I can discriminate against French people. I can discriminate against people with tattoos, people who wear all black, people who study engineering. I can discriminate against people who do not have a high school degree, people who do not have any relevant work experience, or people who have been found guilty of a violent crime. Discrimination, like prejudice, is always negative, but sometimes it's justified. If you don't have your CPR certification, I will discriminate against you if I'm hiring a lifeguard. Discrimination becomes a problem when we do it based on social categories that people have no control over, and when we do it systematically. This leads us to our next bias term. Oppression takes place when discrimination against a group of people is so pervasive that it presses them down. In other words, oppression is a system of forces that presses down on an entire group of people, preventing them from living a good life. It's not just a single instance of discrimination or a single person who behaves in racist ways. It is systemic and only exists at a societal level. So let me give you some examples. Through systematic practices like redlining, Black people have not had access to live in desirable neighborhoods. Black people are the group that is most likely to live in a food desert. That's a place where access to good, healthy, and reasonably priced food is limited or missing. Some fast food and convenience stores, few if any grocery stores, definitely no farmers markets. Schools in primarily Black neighborhoods are chronically underfunded, resulting in worse education. Harsh police practices like stop and frisk target Black people more than any other race. New HIV infections are highest among Black people, and Black women are 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with HIV than their white and Hispanic counterparts. 62% of Black STEM workers say they have experienced a form of racial or ethnic discrimination at work, from earning less than a coworker who performed the same job to experiencing repeated small slights at work called microaggressions. As early as 2018, natural Black hairstyles were not permitted in the U.S. Armed Forces. Many jobs still discourage or actively disallow these hairstyles. Young Black men are more likely to be personally familiar with prison, violence, and crime, and they are also highly likely to have experienced small acts of discrimination on an everyday basis. Hopefully, all of these facts add up to show you that racism capital R, is oppression. It's a system of forces. It's not just one thing or two or three or four. It's not coming from a small group of bad apples. It's not just in certain contexts or situations. It's everything, everyone, everywhere, all the time. It's a multi-layered, interrelated system of forces building up on top of a group of people and pushing them down, keeping them down, preventing them from living a good life. That's oppression. Earlier, I pointed out that I was talking about racism with a capital R. We can apply this capitalization concept to other biases like sexism, classism, and so on. When we talk about a capital letter bias, we're talking about oppression. Big R, racism, is the oppression of non-white groups. Big S, sexism, is the oppression of women or sometimes intersex people. With a big or capital letter, we're talking about that system of forces, pervasive media portrayals, laws, policies, official or not, education, norms, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, all piled onto one another, pressing down an entire group of people. That's the capital letter words: big R racism, big S sexism. The lowercase words, little r racism, little s sexism, are defined in dictionaries much more broadly. Little r racism is any bias against a person because of their race. Which race? Any race. Some individuals are little r racist against white people. Some individuals are little s sexist against men. And according to the dictionary definitions of racism and sexism, lowercase, that's correct. But lowercase letter bias is not oppression. It's not layer upon layer of forces, making that group's life more difficult. It's prejudice, it's discrimination, but it's not oppression. In this course, we're usually going to be talking about uppercase biases, but I'll do my best to remind you of the capitalization, and it's something you can use to differentiate systematic bias from individual instances of bias when you're talking with your family or friends about it, like when someone says they've totally experienced racism against them for being white. And you can say, yeah, that experience is totally real, and it's called discrimination, and it sucks, and it probably felt really painful. And it is racism. It's called lowercase r racism. And then, maybe, if they're open to a conversation about it, you talk about how non-white people might experience something similar, but instead of it just happening in one context or from one source, it's all the time, every day, at work, at home, in private, in public, with all kinds of different people, or even with TV, social media, books, magazines, when they're children, at daycare, at school, on the playground, at the state fair, when they're dating, when they're traveling, always. That's a different kind of racism. That's capital R racism. And that kind of racism doesn't happen to white people. Privilege is the exact reverse of oppression. It is also a system of forces, but in this case, it lifts up a group of people, helping them live a good life. In relation to the examples I just gave, redlining created white-only neighborhoods. Funds that do not go primarily to black schools go instead to primarily white schools. White hairstyles and beauty standards are the standard against which everyone is judged in workplaces. These are privileges white people have at the expense of black people. Privilege, then, is the system of forces that lifts up people, helping make their lives easier. You don't have to be racist to have experienced privilege. Being privileged does not make you a bad person. But we need to acknowledge our own privilege before we can move forward and make any changes to systems of inequality and oppression. It's also important to note that just because you're privileged does not negate other ways in which you are oppressed. Although my examples have been about race, there are other social categories for which you can experience oppression. Consider gender identity, sexual orientation, disability status, class, religion, and so on. For example, I'm white, but I'm also a woman. I have experienced the privileges of whiteness, but I've also experienced the oppression of sexism. That's a capital S. So it's possible to be white yet still experience oppression. However, it's not possible to experience oppression for being white. There is no system of forces pressing down on white people. There is, however, a system of forces pressing down on people for being poor, for being gay, for being trans, for being disabled. Often, people who deny their race-based or gender-based privilege do so because they are oppressed by some other category. It's hard to think of yourself as privileged if you're poor, but privilege comes in many forms. Class privilege is different from white privilege. So you can experience white privilege and class oppression simultaneously. It's possible to be white and oppressed. It's not possible to be oppressed for being white. There is a paradox of privilege, which is threefold. First, others bestow privilege onto you. It's not something you did or earned. Second, the more privileged you are, the less aware you become of that privilege. And third, privilege is not the same as happiness. Let's start with the first one. You don't have to be special or even feel special in order to have access to privilege, because privilege doesn't come from what you've done or even who you are. It comes from other people identifying us as belonging to a particular social category and treating us accordingly. That means you don't have to be white to have access to white privilege. You just need people to believe you're white. And that means that you can be privileged without feeling privileged. That's the second paradox. Privileged people are usually unaware of their own privilege. This is also called the luxury of obliviousness or epistemic privilege. The defining characteristic of privilege is that it lifts you up and makes your life easier. Usually, we don't notice things that make our lives easier. We notice the things that get in our way. Privilege is like a hallway full of open and unlocked doors. You don't really notice the doors because they don't get in your way. You only notice the doors when they're closed, and especially when they're locked. When you're standing in a hallway full of locked, closed doors, you're experiencing oppression, and you will see it and notice it. You may sometimes ask yourself if a door is closed because of your social group identity or some other reason, but you notice that closed door. When you experience privilege, you don't really see that door because it's open and you walk right through. However, having all those doors open does not guarantee success. That's the third paradox of privilege. Having closed doors doesn't guarantee suffering either. Your privilege, the system of forces making your life easier, doesn't mean your life is going to be easy. Privilege does not directly translate to happiness, comfort, and success. You're still going to have to try. It's just going to be a lot easier for you than for someone who does not have those same privileges. In fact, holding on to your privilege can sometimes be a lot of work and even cause you a lot of pain. Remember, in order to get access to privilege, other people must identify you as belonging to a social category. And sometimes that takes work. Men specifically can feel burdened by pressure to be a real man. Some of the pressures they might experience are providing for their families or feeling the expectation that they must conceal their emotions. This cost of male privilege is far outweighed by the benefits, though. On page 39 of the Johnson reading, he calls this pain and urges us not to call it oppression. It's absolutely possible and even common to be privileged and also to experience pain associated with that privilege. That's that third paradox of privilege, that privilege is not the same as happiness. So you can see these three paradoxes are interrelated. You cannot earn privilege. It's something that's bestowed to you by others based on how they perceive you, which means that you don't have to feel privileged to be privileged. And just because you are privileged doesn't mean you feel good or happy. Those in combination are what we call the paradox of privilege.